Christmas Eve, 1944. In the frozen hills above the village of Celles, Belgium, 3 German Panther tanks sit dead in the snow. Their engines are silent, not from battle damage, but because they have no fuel left to burn. Behind them, 10 half-tracks wait in the dark, each Panther towing trucks that can no longer move on their own. Somewhere to the west, invisible through the fog, runs the Meuse River, the last major barrier before the open roads to Antwerp. These tanks are 4 miles from it. 4 miles from changing the outcome of the war in the West. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the moment Adolf Hitler gambled everything on one last offensive in the West, and came closer to succeeding than most people today realize. For 72 hours in December 1944, the outcome of the war in Europe was genuinely uncertain. American lines had been shattered, entire divisions were encircled, and a spearhead of German armor was racing toward a river that, if crossed, could have split the Allied armies in two. This is the story of how that spearhead got so close, and why it never made it across. By the autumn of 1944, Germany was losing on every front. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pushing toward the German border itself. But Hitler believed one bold stroke could still change everything. He ordered a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same thickly wooded region German tanks had used to stun France in 1940. The plan was audacious: punch through the thin American lines, seize the port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies apart. It was planned in near total secrecy, under the code name Wacht am Rhine, Watch on the Rhine. The Ardennes was chosen for a reason. Its dense forests and narrow valleys made it difficult terrain for tanks, which was exactly why the Allies had left it thinly defended, believing no major attack would come through there. American units stationed along this front were either battle-worn divisions resting after heavy fighting, or green troops experiencing combat for the first time. Thick winter fog and low cloud cover blanketed the region that December, grounding Allied aircraft that would normally have spotted a buildup of this size. The Germans had chosen their moment, and the weather, with brutal precision. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, that silence broke. Nearly 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front, the barrage lighting the dark forest like sheet lightning. Behind it came a force of almost 200,000 German soldiers, backed by hundreds of tanks, including the newest and heaviest the Wehrmacht possessed, the King Tiger. American units, caught by surprise and outnumbered in many sectors, were overrun within hours. Telephone lines were cut. Command posts lost contact with their forward units. For the soldiers on watch that morning, the war had suddenly turned upside down. The heaviest blow fell on the Lossheim Gap, a lightly defended corridor manned by inexperienced American divisions who had never faced combat before. German armor poured through, encircling entire regiments before they even understood what was happening. Roads jammed with retreating American vehicles and confused refugees fleeing west. Within 2 days, 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, nearly 7,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender, one of the largest mass capitulations of American troops in the European War. The German offensive was ahead of schedule, and for the first time in months, it looked unstoppable. The offensive's brutality became clear on December 17, near the crossroads at Bastogne, close to the town of Malmedy. There, soldiers from a German armored column under Colonel Joachim Peiper captured roughly 80 American prisoners of war. The Americans were disarmed, herded into a field, and then shot. It became known as the Malmedy massacre, one of the most notorious war crimes committed against American troops in the European theater. News of the killings spread through the American ranks within days, hardening the resolve of soldiers who now understood exactly what kind of fight this had become. Further south, at the town of St. Vith, American engineers and the newly arrived 7th Armored Division made a stand that would prove critical. They were not strong enough to stop the German advance outright, but they didn't need to. Every hour they held the town was an hour the German timetable slipped further behind. St. Vith finally fell on December 21st, 6 days after the offensive began, but by then the delay had already cost the Germans something they could never get back: time. And time, in this battle, was running out for both sides. Meanwhile, Colonel Piper's armored spearhead pushed deeper than any other German unit, racing toward American fuel depots he desperately needed to keep moving. At Stavelot, his men seized part of a massive Allied fuel dump, but not enough, and not fast enough. Blown bridges, minefields, and fierce American resistance funneled his column into narrow roads where it could not maneuver. By December 24th, surrounded and completely out of fuel, Piper abandoned his remaining tanks at the village of L'Église and led his surviving men on foot back through American lines. The most dangerous German thrust of the entire offensive had run dry, while the northern German thrust stalled. The real danger was shifting south and west, toward a small market town most maps barely noted, Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there, making it the single most important crossroads in the entire region. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the German timetable. On December 18th and 19th, American commanders rushed the 101st Airborne Division into the town by truck, arriving just ahead of the German columns closing in from 3 directions. They had almost no time to dig in before the ring around them began to close. By December 21st, Bastogne was completely surrounded. Roughly 18,000 American troops, mostly from the 101st Airborne, along with attached armor and artillery units, held a shrinking perimeter against a much larger German force closing in from every side. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medical equipment ran desperately low. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and hundreds of wounded lay in cellars and barns with almost no medicine to treat them. Outside the perimeter, German commanders were confident the town would fall within days. Inside it, the Americans dug in and refused to move. On December 22nd, a German delegation approached the American lines under a flag of truce, carrying a written demand for surrender, warning of Bastogne's total destruction if the Americans refused. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the ultimatum and gave a reply that would become legendary in its brevity: "Nuts." The German officers, confused by the American slang, had to have it explained to them as a flat refusal. The message spread through the encircled American ranks within hours, and morale, remarkably, held. For 6 days after the offensive began, thick fog and low cloud cover had grounded almost all Allied aircraft, denying American and British forces their greatest advantage: total control of the skies. Without air support, ground troops fought largely alone against superior numbers of German armor. But on December 23rd, the weather broke. Clear skies opened over the battlefield for the first time since the attack began, and Allied fighter bombers and transport aircraft surged into action. Cargo planes dropped desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies into Bastogne, while fighters began hunting the German columns strung out along the roads below. While Bastogne held, the German 2nd Panzer Division had bypassed the town entirely and continued its dash toward the Meuse River, the objective that mattered most. On December 20th, its reconnaissance battalion crossed the Arth River using a bridge other German units had dismissed as unusable. The rest of the division followed, pushing further west than any other German unit in the entire offensive. Ahead of them lay open country, and beyond that, the Meuse. Behind them, their fuel trucks were falling further and further back, unable to keep pace with the advance. By December 23rd and 24th, the spearhead of the 2nd Panzer Division had reached the village of Celles, astonishingly close to its goal. Reconnaissance elements were now only a few miles from the Meuse River itself, closer to that objective than any other German force would get during the entire war in the West. If they crossed, they could threaten the bridges the Allies needed to supply their entire northern front. British armored units had already moved into position on the far bank, guarding the crossings at Dinant and Namur. The gap between the two sides had narrowed to almost nothing, but the tanks that had come so far could go no further. Strung out at the end of a narrow, exposed corridor, the 2nd Panzer Division's advance guard ran completely out of fuel near Celles on Christmas Eve. Without gasoline, tanks that had crossed half of Belgium became fixed targets, unable to advance, retreat, or maneuver. The clear skies that had returned 2 days earlier now worked entirely against them. American and British aircraft, finally free to fly, began systematically destroying the stranded column from above, while the U.S. 2nd Armored Division closed in on the ground to finish what the fuel shortage had started. By December 26, the pocket at Celles had been destroyed. Dozens of German tanks and armored vehicles lay wrecked and burned across the frozen hillside, their crews killed, captured, or scattered on foot back toward German lines. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the German army, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. It was the western high-water mark of the entire Ardennes offensive. The Germans would never again come this close to the Meuse, or to the victory they had gambled everything to win. The same day the trap closed at Celles, General George S. Patton's Third Army, in a remarkable logistical feat, pivoted 90 degrees and drove north through winter conditions to break the siege of Bastogne. On December 26, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division punched through the German ring and linked up with the exhausted defenders inside the town. After 8 days of encirclement, freezing cold, and dwindling supplies, the siege was over. The crossroads that had cost the Germans so much time and so many of their remaining reserves had held. The Battle of the Bulge remains the largest single battle fought by the United States Army in the Second World War, involving roughly 600,000 American troops before it ended in late January 1945. Historians still study it as the moment Hitler's last major offensive in the West was broken, not by a single decisive stroke, but by a combination of stubborn defense at places like Bastogne and Saint-Mend. With a fuel shortage the Germans never solved, and an Allied air force that returned to the sky at exactly the moment it mattered most. Germany's last reserves of trained men and armor were spent here and never rebuilt. Victory came at enormous human cost. American forces suffered over 75,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, many from frostbite and exposure in one of the coldest winters Western Europe had seen in years. German losses were comparably severe, with tens of thousands killed or captured and the near-total destruction of several elite armored divisions. For the men who survived, the memories of frozen foxholes, overrun positions, and comrades lost at places like Malmedy never fully faded. The Ardennes had tested both armies to their absolute limit, and both would carry its scars for the rest of their lives. Today, the hillside above Celles is quiet. Farmland has reclaimed most of the ground where German tanks once sat frozen and empty, waiting for fuel that never came. But on the exact spot where the advance stopped, a single preserved Panther tank still stands as a monument, a reminder of how close the war in the West came to turning, and how it was decided not by a grand battle, but by a handful of miles, a few missing gallons of fuel, and men on both sides who refused to give any further ground. 4 miles from the Meuse. That was as far as the war would let them go.